Hi, I'm Amanda,
And I'm Cara.
and welcome to the Historical Society podcast. Thank you for joining us. Today is another episode we're going to look back into early history, and I think this
Yay!
Kara's favorite. We're going to
I
look.
told her I appreciate it and it's relevant and interesting, but I like just bullet points and go. And Amanda likes bullet points, read very deeply, talk about it in depth, and then go on to the next bullet point and do the same thing.
Yeah. We're here to learn, Kara.
Potato, potato.
Okay, so, I mean, I don't want it to be boring, and that's
I think it's just my personality type, that's all.
sure. I mean, or just different interests a little bit, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
So,
Yeah.
I was talking to Kara before we started this recording, and I was reflecting on how much I'm excited to go to the art museum because they have a little bit of a display of artifacts from this time period we're going to talk about. And I was like, oh, and Carrie were like, what?
No, it's not that bad. I do find it interesting and relevant
Okay.
to what we're talking about, obviously.
Yeah.
It's just some of it just gets a little bit like, okay,
Right. Okay.
that's all.
Well, okay.
That's not a big deal. To each their own, and everyone does things differently. And you're right, everybody has different interests and levels of interests and things, and that's okay.
That's true. And the heart of the reason we're doing this, looking back into time, is to solely focus on what's happening to women during that time frame, so that we can then understand, our
Obviously,
current
yeah.
time frame and how we got here, basically.
Absolutely, and I absolutely see the value in that.
That's right. Oh yeah. Okay. Okay. So today's episode. What did you say?
We'll see.
We'll see. All right. So today's episode is going to be a continuation of the series, The Origins of the Patriarchy. This will be part 3, Rise of the Patriarchies. I feel like we should have some
Oh,
like,
it sounds so interesting. It's like a good movie title.
yeah. And then you hear me talk and you're like, but it's really not that interesting.
Dun dun dun.
Yeah. When you have like Star Wars, like Darth Vader music. Bum, 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 ba-da, bum, ba-da,
They're like back in the Stone Age.
Okay,
Maybe
so
if
here
we
we
had the guy that reads
James
does
Earl
the opening for
Jones.
movies. No, the guy that
Oh.
does the movie opening that you hear him in trailers. That would be interesting.
Yeah, I don't know who that is.
I don't know his name, but it's like, it'll be like a Transformer movie, and he'll be like back in the age before blah blah blah. Do you know what I'm talking about? The guy.
Yeah. I could try to
The
read
guy's
these
voice
sources
booms
like
and-
that. I can't. I'm not going to be able to do it, but I'll
No.
try. History.
No, he's famous. He's
From the
famous for
dawn
it.
of civilization to the present day.
Nope,
Released
it's not
by
the same.
DK and the Smithsonian.
It's different.
No? Okay. What if I do like the British, like
No,
Britannica.com?
no.
Okay. I'll just keep going. History.com.
Okay.
World Encyclopedia at
Oh my
worldhistory.org.
Don't make us
Okay.
re-record the
All
book
right.
anymore.
I'll stop. Oh, man.
There's still time.
Yeah, there's still time. Okay. All right. Then the last, the last source is The Patriarchs, The Origins of Inequality by Angela Saini. And I think I left my book over there. But yes, it's a great book. And I'm going to quote from it here and there. And it was useful for me to create a little bit of a timeline. The other book that was very helpful for me was also the first one I read, History from the Dawn of Civilization. It's a picture book, which I love picture books.
Is that there's an author to that one?
It's just it's like a large amount of, like, a lot of authors, basically. A lot of researchers
It's
would
like,
have written.
okay, compiled.
Yeah, it's a big compilation. So it's a giant book.
It says it's released by DK. Who's that?
It's a publisher. I can't remember what it stands for.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, and the Smithsonian.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
But what was helpful for me, they have a chronological ordering. It's the history of the world, basically. But they have all these cool charts so I can see the things happening simultaneously through time.
sure.
And then they have like little subsections where they show you pictures of the artifacts. And I love it. It's great.
Cool.
Highly recommended.
What are your other sources?
Britannicahistory.com. and then worldhistory.org, and then the patriarchs. And there are a couple other articles that I'll reference as I go along. But
Okay.
those are very helpful to me.
Those are the sources.
Yeah. The big
I
ones.
listen to this other podcast. It's a true crime podcast, but when they do the sources, like they just read them real fast, like blah, 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 and then they're done. Just as a quick, like, yeah, they just do it really quickly and then they get on with the story.
Maybe I could do that next time.
Maybe.
You're like, whatever. You're
You
like,
do you.
okay.
You do what you want to do.
Cool.
I was just saying, I noticed it last time. But now that we do a podcast, it's just interesting because I know we need to reference it and it's just a quick thing, get it done.
Right.
And get on with the podcast
Right.
topic.
Okay. So, in episode 10, we discussed the Copper and the Bronze Ages and how we see that women were found to still have important positions during that time frame around the globe. And we looked specifically, the locations were Britain, the Iberian Peninsula, and then areas around Denmark. And as we discussed a little bit in that episode, as you move from the Copper Age to the Bronze Age, you're going to start to see more of a patriarchal bent happening. And so originally I was going to try to move us into the Iron Age, but there's just too much. There's too many things happening to go there quickly. And not only that, but the patriarchies, they start to happen in the Bronze Age. So I felt like we had to stick in the Bronze Age to start looking at kind of that reality. And so we're going to, like I said, we're going to stay in the Bronze Age. We're going to talk about a specific civilization more extensively. And the part of the reason I picked this is because Angela Saini's premise in her book, The Patriarchs, is that the patriarchy kind of as an overall idea starts to really develop because of the emergence of city-states. And a city-state is basically like you would have like a city center kind of, like perhaps with defensive walls or a palace or a temple or something like that. And that's where the ruler would live. And then he would control all of the surrounding area and all the people there. So that's kind of a city-state concept. So there was like a centralized government sort of. So the one that we're going to focus on in particular, it takes place in Mesopotamia. And that's what the area around what today is Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Kuwait. So it's kind of that area there. That's what was called Mesopotamia. And so a lot of these city-states are going to be in that area. And then by the end of the 4th millennia BCE, so 4000 BCE, in Mesopotamia, almost all the people were living in these types of city-states. And it was similar also in Egypt, which has its own thing happening right now as well. Society had become hierarchical, with elite rulers at the top and low-level commoners at the bottom of the totem pole. Trading of goods and ownership of property, people became common, and the rise of the city-state began.
Sounds familiar, like what we live in now.
Yeah, it does actually. Okay, the most prominent.
mean-
Go ahead.
To some degree.
Yeah,
To some degree.
well,
The hierarchy.
totally. I feel like there really are a lot of similarities. You really see it, very much so. Okay, so the most prominent city-state around 3000 BCE was called Uruk. No idea if I'm saying that right. I should have looked it up. Uruk. I'm gonna say Uruk. Do you have any
How about
thoughts,
it?
Kara? What do you think? What's your
I think you should not make a big deal about it and just say what you think it is.
whatever, Kara? You're no fun. Okay. All right. So Uruk was part of Sumerian society. And at one point, this area not at the 3000 BCE point, but later on, they think that it's possible that the civilization grew up to 90,000 people. So it was a very large
Wow. Okay.
city state.
If you'd like for me to look it up, I'm happy to.
Nah, it's fine.
All right.
Okay. Sumerian society was also the first to use written languages, starting around 3100 BCE. And this writing was originally solely of things like related to trading and business and tallies and censuses and all
Okay.
of that kind of stuff. All right. Now, that book I was talking about, the Lovely Picture book, I wanted to read a quote from this book about the city state because I feel like it gave a really good description of
Okay.
that type of life. Okay, so here's the quote. Life was unsanitary and chaotic, with people living in close quarters. Craftspeople and food producers became more specialized and interdependent, and administrative specialists sprang up to regulate trade. Social status and wealth assumed increased importance. As towns grew, so society became increasingly hierarchical. One can liken these societies to a pyramid. At the top was the ruler, who may have governed as both living god and secular leader. Beneath him were his close family and a small privileged class of high officials and priests. Lower down the scale came artisans, the lesser functionaries, soldiers, and the commoners who were the manpower upon which all society depended. Early Sumerian rulers and Egyptian pharaohs ruled by precedent, using the decisions of their predecessors rather than written laws. They gave limited public appearances and lived in seclusion. Perhaps the fact that they were not often seen in public led to the idea that they had supernatural powers. A divine ruler's power came from his ability to control the labor of thousands of commoners. His authority came not only from a threat of force, but also from pervasive ideas and religious beliefs commemorated by art and writing on temple walls and reinforced by elaborate ceremonies. The latter were often displays of power that required imposing settings and conspicuous burial places, such as pyramids. Also, just momentarily, like, this is basically what happens in authoritarian states, because these are basically dictatorships in some way.
Yeah.
Monarchies, I guess, technically, like a sort of a.
Dictator.
He was a dictator. I added the tater.
Yeah, it's from Big Bang.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's why I added the tater.
But you think about common states like Russia or North Korea, they have those huge military parades where they like show off all their missiles and
I was just thinking about Putin because it talks about he lived in seclusion, doesn't he? Isn't he known to live sort of secluded from everything? He's afraid of germs and things like that.
yeah. Yeah. So it's interesting. Okay. So that was a little bit of like what life could have been like in the Sumerian cities, the city states. And in this particular time frame, there were roughly 12 city states in that area. So some of the others were Kish, Akkad. I feel like I'm just making up names.
And others,
And others. And
etc.
etc. And then the time frame we're looking at specifically is these kind of city states starting around 3000 BCE. So that's kind of where we're at, just so that's clear. And then so Angela Angela Saini, in her book, she starts focusing on this particular area around page 112. If you're looking at the paperback, hold on.
Bless you.
Excuse me. Okay. And this is a quote from page 112. She's talking to someone named James Scott, who at some point I wrote down what his background was, but I believe he's a social scientist. I think he passed away. Gosh, and now I want to know. I think he was the professor. Cara, you want to do this?
Here, what do you want?
Okay, James Scott, and then look up professor of anthropology. Because I think he was professor of anthropology at Yale, but was also professor of political science, I believe, at Yale. We'll just look this up real fast because I found this really interesting. Oh no, wait, maybe
Okay,
this
what do
might
you
not
wanna
be
know
James
specifically?
Scott. Yeah, so who is James Scott?
This is American political scientist and anthropologist.
There you go. Okay, that was him.
American political scientist, specializing in comparative politics.
Okay, cool. I remembered correctly. All right, so
Yeah.
this is him. He says administrative tablets from the Sumerian city of Uruk nearly 5,000 years ago are lists, lists, lists. Person power is the key to power in general. You need units of aggregations, units of discipline, units of taxation. And so the Sumerian people were using their writing system. I believe it was like cuneiform was their writing system, of tracking their goods, their people. It was just they were
Okay.
keeping, because that was their power, right?
Hmm.
And Elizabeth Staney goes on to say, keeping a population growing was best served by creating conditions in which as many women as possible were having as many babies as they could, raising those children to be useful to the state as workers, warriors, and breeders. Ancient
That's what I was going to ask. I was like, where do women come into
Yeah.
this?
Ancient Mesopotamian cities became concerned with taking censuses, including gender as a category alongside age and location, so they could measure their human resources and collect taxes more efficiently.
Wow.
Cat-
Human resources.
yeah, categories were needed for hierarchies to function, for leaders to know how many people they had and how to allocate work and rations between them. People had to be given social codes to follow, so the state would keep ticking efficiently without falling apart. It was like a machine in a sense. Every part was designed for a particular function. And so the
It's
concept,
interesting.
yeah,
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. But it's interesting. Like something like that could be a healthy thing. Like everybody plays a role in the in the bigger functioning of something. But it's so easy to see how it could be how it could go negative and be
totally.
abused.
Yeah, and also that people are locked into a role. Like you don't have a choice in your role. You're just put
Yep,
there.
kind of typecast and stuck.
Yeah, like a gear, like a cog in the
Yeah,
whole
you're only
your
good
work.
for this. Do your job. Yeah,
Right. So there's no
doesn't
freedom.
really encourage creativity.
Not at all. Definitely not. Yeah. Am I blurry to you, Kara, on your
Yeah, same,
Yeah,
same.
you're blurry to
Is the
me.
internet kind of
It's
being
probably
weird?
it's being weird.
Sometimes it does that, but it always says
Recording
somewhere
is
on the
higher
screen.
quality. It says it. Yeah, I
Yeah,
see it. Yeah. Okay, that's good.
you do. Okay, I don't see it in mine, but that's okay. I mean, my screen when I just went to see if I was blurry. I mean, I have you pulled up most of the time, but I don't look blurry, but you do.
Right, same. It's the same down here.
Okay,
It says it's
it's fine. I'm sure.
uploading it, so it should be because it's
I think
recording. Yeah, it's recording to our devices. I think as it kind of it. That's
I
I
think
don't
it's
know.
fine.
We'll find out. It did this last time as well, and it ended up being okay. All right. Okay, so I was going to talk about basically once you start defining roles for people in the city state, you then have to enforce them. And as time passes, you'll see these roles become more and more strict for everybody, not just women, but also men. Like men have to do this, women have to do this. That's it. No, there's no deviating from that. And
Yeah,
another thing that we also see during this time frame is slavery and human trafficking. And so it's really a
right.
tragedy. But it makes sense that something like the patriarchy would be born out of this time as well. Because when you start treating people not as humans anymore, it opens up the doorway for you to do a bunch of other horrible things as well. So yeah, like I wrote, if you are subjugating segments of the population and enslaving people, it's easy to understand how the patriarchy came about. It's really sad. And so we see basically systems of oppression are being created simultaneously, lots of different types of systems. Yeah. And then Angela Saini, she basically states this, and I think in a clearer way than what I just did. And this comes from page 18, again, of the paperback of her book. If the old notion about all males being naturally dominant over all females is put to one side for a moment, what else could explain the changing pattern of gender relations in a region like ancient Mesopotamia? One answer might be that power was sweepingly taken away from all women, and that categorization by the state was the tool by which women were both classed and systematically disenfranchised. By gradually introducing broad rules and laws, an entire group of people and all their individual complexity could be effectively pushed to the margins and suppressed. We have plenty of historical parallels for this in the practice of racial segregation in the American South, in India's caste system, and in the aristocracies of Europe. Gendered rules not only forced people into narrow social roles to better serve the state, they could also allow elite men to grab power, rights, and property from the women with whom these things were previously shared.
Yeah,
I
so
think
it's
that's
basically what we were saying.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
It is, but I just felt like it was just
No,
she said it better.
it's great. Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And so the rules and laws created by the rulers, then enforced by the state, the religion, the priest, the other ruling elites would dramatically reshape societies, reshape the meaning of life itself for those citizens as well. And another thing it got me thinking about was also just the social conditioning of people living in societies like this, where these
For
laws
sure.
starts to shift. Because what happens
Yeah,
then,
fall in line.
yeah, you have to fall in line, but then the children who are born into the
Expectations.
system, right? Everything begins to change because they only know the system. They only know these
Hmm.
rules. They only know
Yeah,
these roles in these
what we grew up
categories. So you
learning and
start,
embracing.
yeah, so you start to think, this is what our societies have deemed correct or normal and proper,
Right.
even though that they're very arbitrary or they're completely false.
Yep.
And you know that type of, it's just basically manipulation by these ruling elites to garner the benefits they want, basically. It's sad.
Yep.
And we see this like, in her paragraph she was talking about, we see this in the US with race, you see it in India, and a book that really talks about this, is actually behind me on my, which shoulder is that, my right shoulder? It looks like my left on the screen. Like, it's by
Oh,
Isabel
God.
Wilkerson, called Caste, and she really focuses in on how that, in the United States is basically like a caste system. What was here originally, with white men being at the very peak, the pinnacle, the pyramid, the top of the pyramid, and then, people of color and indigenous people being at the very bottom. Yep. Okay.
Cool, cool.
Cool, cool. Kara, what does box it up come from? Is that The Office?
It's from The Office. It's something Andy says.
Yeah,
Cool,
so
cool. Box it up.
yeah, so we say this around the house. Cool, cool, box it up. We just just throw it in there. I wanted to say it, but I thought we should preface it first. Cool, cool, box it up. Okay. All right. I talked about that. The other thing that I wanted to think about really briefly was just the other ways of enforcing these roles psychologically, basically. So you have things like shame and fear and hatred and greed, all of these things kind of working, to maintain this system in place as well. Do you have any thoughts, Kara?
Not right now.
Not right now. Box it up.
But I might in a minute.
Okay.
Why do you ask?
No, I was just
Did I
curious
look bored?
if you had
Checked
anything.
out?
No, I was just curious if you had anything
I
to
was
add.
right.
I saw some drool and maybe a little snortle. Just kidding.
You don't know. You didn't see anything.
I didn't. No. No, I was just curious because I had this like, I think it's because there's this big space here in my Google document. I was like, oh, I should say something. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Okay.
No, not
So,
yet. I don't have anything to say yet.
okay. I had another quote from James Scott, who we know who he is now. I do think he passed away, though. I feel like when I researched him, he had passed away. She quotes him in her book, but I just wanted to know what book it was, and I wanted to kind of see it for myself. So he read a book. I think it's a book, or it's just like a long pamphlet. I don't know. I think it's a book.
Okay.
Called The Public Discourse of Domination. And so he's looking at it from like a socializing kind of perspective. And his quote is, the members of dominant groups, one supposes, learn the knack of acting with authority and self-assurance in the course of socialization. For hereditary ruling groups, the training typically, oh my gosh. Typically, why am I saying like that's weird? Okay. For hereditary
Well,
ruling groups, the training typically begins at birth. The aristocrat learns how to act like an aristocrat, the Brahmin like a Brahmin, the man like a man. So that's what I was saying earlier before I couldn't say typically.
you just get raised in it and you accept it as the norm.
You just accept it, yeah. And so that's the unfortunate system that happens. The early the early people, when the system is originally founded, they see it for what it is. But then slowly over time, it becomes more and more entrenched because people don't
Yeah.
question it. That's just it. This is the way it appears, as though this is the way things have always been. So this is the way things should
Right.
be. Yeah. Then another point that Angela Saini makes, she talks about these two current one's a psychologist and one's a psychoanalyst. So the psychologist's name is Carol Gilligan. I believe she teaches at NYU, and psychoanalyst Naomi Snyder. And they wrote a book together. Their book is entitled "Why Does Patriarchy Persist?" And
Yeah.
their premise is that I think the book is. I didn't read this book, so I can't even summarize it. But one of the ideas they present is that, and it makes perfect sense, right? So to have the patriarchy, you have to enforce this category. You have to. And
Okay.
so the quote is from them: "A man, in order to be a man, must not be a woman or like a woman, and vice versa." So it must remain this way.
It's like very
Yeah, this very rigid.
locked in.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
if people start to kind of pull that apart, then the system fails. The patriarchy fails, and that's something I was thinking about. Like, things like non-binary or transgender, or you have women who are more masculine or men who are more feminine. All of those
Yeah,
things,
just breaking outside of the gender roles, even if you're born cis
right?
gender.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's interesting.
it
And
is.
we've seen that play out over time, even over the last many decades.
Totally. And right now it's like such a problem in this country, that people I feel like it's because, you know, it's a little bit of what we talked about. It's like you're a fish swimming in water and you don't even know that someone changed the color of the I don't know. I'm trying to come up with an analogy and it's not very good, but let's say you're in a fish tank
Do you?
and sometime at night someone came by and put some dye in the water.
Okay.
And you had no idea it happened, but now you're floating around in red water, and you don't know. This is a really bad analogy. But you think it's been that way the whole time. You're like, I think, was it always this color? Maybe it
You don't think
was.
you'd notice?
I
Was
don't
he
know.
asleep?
Maybe they're colorblind. Maybe they're like dogs.
Maybe they don't have eyes.
But they're fish though. They have eyes. This imaginary fish I'm talking about has eyes. So
Not the only problem I see here.
okay, so it's sort of like, I don't know. I feel like I've lost this analogy. It wasn't a good one to begin with, but you don't. I guess what I'm saying is we're like the little fish, and we don't even recognize when something huge happened and is impacting the way we're living because it just
Sticking
seems
with
like
fish.
it's always been there. The water has always been red. It's just the way it is,
Stick-
even though water's
sticking with
not that
fish.
way.
Okay.
Right? And so women grow up, and all of us grow up in this society that has very much a patriarchal foundation. And, someone like, I don't always like to talk about Donald Trump, but like, we have like people who are fighting really strongly for these traditional gender roles. Like women should be stay-at-home moms. And if you want to be that, I think that's great. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, and if that's what you want to do, or if that's what you need to do for your family, fine. There is no shame from
Or
this
want to do.
podcast. Yeah. I think it's more like we want women to be able to have choices. And if that's the choice, that's the choice. But, if you want to do a career and that, if you want to do your career, whatever, But anyway, right now, because the patriarchy must maintain its power, the fact that people are pushing so strongly against non-traditional roles, right? Or like men who want to stay at home, or women who want to work, or people who are transgendered, or people who identify as non-binary. Like that's just like they can't have that. That the whole thing is going to fall apart. And I think that's kind of what's happening, what they're kind of saying in this book as well.
Takes away that certainty of how things function.
Right. I'm sorry.
People.
I'm sorry about that analogy. That wasn't very good.
That's okay. We should just stay away from fish.
Fish stinketh from the head.
Girl.
I think isn't that like a Benjamin Franklin thing? If a fish stinks after 3 days, it's like the same with like
I have heard
guests.
that. Yeah.
I think that's a Benjamin
Yep.
Franklin quote. Okay. All right. Moving on.
Moving along.
Okay,
Nothing to see
so
here.
the other thing I wanted to bring up while I've been looking at some of these early history timeframes is
Okay.
a lot of people talk about how when new discoveries happen. So, like in our previous episode, when we talked about the origins of the patriarchy, there were discoveries that happened where they originally thought these artifacts or these remains were a man, and then they turned out to be a woman. And so, similar things are that way, even just when it comes to translating words from the past. And a lot
Yeah.
of times they will have translated them a certain way based on the concept of male dominance and how that's just the way things were seen, even by the researchers. So, Angela, I keep wanting to say her name's Elizabeth. Angela Saini. And this is, if you do read this book, this is from page 116. There's a term that harimtu and then harim natu. That's funny. Which has been interpreted in different for a very long time as a prostitute, a woman who was some type of sacred prostitute. That's what it was called for a long time. But then there are current scholars who are actually questioning that translation. But there's a lot of resistance because of the concept of male dominance and how they think that that's how it should be read, even today. So that's just an example of, I kind of feel like the more time that elapses and the more people who look at human remains or the, artifacts or things, and they do these modern testings on, human
Yeah.
remains, I feel like you're going to see more of that personally. I mean, it seems like it.
Right. We talked about that in the past episode. People only see things, or at least knee jerk, and they see things through their own lens, through the lens of their experience.
Right.
So then, if you have more experiences, you see more things, you understand more things.
Right.
Start to shift your thinking.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. We see this happen in a lot of different areas,
Right.
not just with like whatever this would be, archaeology, or I don't know what that would be.
Yeah. Coda is whining again. I'll have to deal with her in a second. Boo.
She'll fill out. She's not
Yeah, she's
Just
fine.
let her-
I think she
you
just
have
wants a
to-
crunchy, but don't tell her I
exactly. She
said that.
doesn't need a crunch. No, I won't.
Okay. All right. So just to kind of, there was this other, I wrote a little paragraph about this in particular. So there was a woman named Stephanie Boudin who is a historian and an independent scholar at the University of Pennsylvania. And she wrote a book about this very thing, about those, specifically those two words in the translation.
Okay.
It's called The Myth of Sacred Prostitution in Antiquity. And she's commented that there has been strong resistance among historians to reconsider the long-held meaning of that word. There's like the singular and the plural of that word. She believes this is because of sexism. Stephanie Boudin believes that the proper meaning of the word is more likely an independent or single woman, a woman who is not married, or a woman without a father. She believes this woman is free to do as she wishes. Boudin also bases this on the reality that women of this time frame could be tavern owners, cooks, entertainers, healers, and traders. So that's part of it. And let's see. This one, I have another quote here. There was another woman, associate professor of classics and women's gender studies at Denison University, who says, quote, "It's as if there were no space for women to inhabit in between the well-to-do citizen wife and the woman who sells sex for financial support." So she's of the mindset that this word should be reevaluated as well. And yeah, so yeah, like I was saying, my notes here, basically, one has to wonder during this time frame what else has been misrepresented by sexist views, by researchers holding these sexist
Yeah,
views.
for sure.
Or maybe swimming in the red water without knowing it.
Amanda.
Okay, I'm just trying to bring back life to this sad
We should
analogy.
leave it.
Just leave it. I need to see the live it die.
Just leave it.
Let's
Just
let it
leave
go. Pull the plug.
Yeah.
down the drain. Okay. So,
Crazy.
unfortunately for women, even though they were saying that women, they could run their own business, they could own their own money, they could take part in family businesses, that some of that will see it. I don't know. I should have shut off my volume. I apologize. My bad. Let me turn off my watch now. That
We gotta keep moving. We got a lot to talk about here.
women having those freedoms, basically, we'll see those freedoms become more and more constricted as we go through these things. All right, so the other thing I wanted to look at was what did life look like during this time frame for women, and I based this on a different article from worldhistory.org. It's called "Women in Ancient Mesopotamia," written by Joshua Mark, published October 7th of 2022. And he basically says that women had more freedoms in early Mesopotamia, and that over time, women's freedoms slowly eroded. So that's kind of basically what I just said. Women were expected to marry and have children, and unless you were a priestess, you could marry, but you didn't have children, I guess. I thought that was interesting. You weren't allowed to. And this is a quote of his: "Generally speaking, though, Mesopotamian women had significant rights, could own businesses, buy and sell land, live on their own, initiate divorce, and though officially secondary to men, found ways to assert their autonomy." And then to continue going forward, so he's talking about like that. We remember when we talked about 3000 BCE, so that's kind of the early part of this Mesopotamian life. And then as you get all the way up until like 650 BCE, things have changed. And so he goes on to say, although the patriarchy sought to control women's rights and personal choices throughout all these eras, women are still recorded as landowners, business owners, administrators, bureaucrats, doctors, scribes, clergy, and in rare cases, even monarchs. And he notes that, so we talked a little bit about how in this society, and we'll see it from here on out, that you have these classes of divisions as well. So not only this division of male and female, but then you have classes of males and females, right? So at the top, he talks about there being 5 classes. You have nobility, and then underneath that you have clergy, and then you have upper class, and then lower class, and then slaves. And so it's a caste system, just like what we would see in other societies today. But of this time, this is kind of where we're starting. And then I wanted to read one more because he does talk a little bit more specifically about the women from this time frame. Women continue to be defined more or less by this hierarchy and maintained their rights until the fall of the Sasanian Empire to the Muslim Arabs in 651 CE. Afterwards, women's rights declined far more dramatically than any waning under either Sargon or Hammurabi. Some scholars have correlated the decline of women's status to the rise of male deities and a greater focus on heavily patriarchal religious systems, though this claim has been challenged. Even so, after 651 CE, there is a clear decline in women's rights in the region. And so I was thinking it was 651 BCE, but it's later. So, anyway, so that's another point that I found kind of interesting. I looked a little bit at the religions of kind of like early peoples, and a lot of times the early times would have been like some type of ancestral worship, perhaps, and like sun worship or moon worship. And then as you get closer to here, you have God, like deities, like gods. This particular, so the Sumerian people, a lot of them were still kind of worshiping goddesses. They would have the figurines and like the temples to the goddess or whatever. And then over time, the deities changed to male deities, which is kind of what he's saying. But Angela Saini, she believes that the switch was more around the city state and not necessarily solely religion or solely another thing. She likes to suggest that it was this categorization of people by elite rulers. But she also posits at the end of her book that a lot of things made patriarchies kind of spring up, and she does suggest that religion played a role in it as well. So, yeah. Okay. Now, what is interesting, there are some women who actually were rulers during this time frame, which is a little surprising. That's why at the end of his article, one of those paragraphs, he said that even it's rare, but even they can ascend to the monarchy. So the first woman I wanted to focus on, and we don't know a whole lot about these women just because it's from so long ago, but this woman's name was Queen Puabi of Ur, and she lived somewhere around 2600 BCE. And I got information about her from an article from Atlas Obscura written by Sarah Dunn entitled "The Most Lavish Mesopotamian Tomb." Oh my gosh, I'm gonna start it over. Got to start that over. The most lavish Mesopotamian tomb ever found belongs to a woman. And if you go to this article, there are pictures of the artifacts from the tomb that she was dressed in. It's really stunning, like huge, like gold headpieces and like this really elaborate, like shoulder thing with like bright colored fabrics. Anyway, okay, so I'm gonna read from this really quickly. Just describe her. I'll probably skip around a little bit. So her tomb was found in the late 1920s in the Iraqi desert by British archaeologist Leonard Woolley. And the tomb was very lavish. So this article, I believe, was written in 2022. So this would have been a 4,500-year-old skeleton from now. And the skeleton was draped in gold and precious stones. Golden rings decorated each finger, a golden looped belt lay across the waist, and a golden headdress with intricately wrought leaves and standing flowers adorned the head. 3 more bodies, presumably servants, accompanied the royal skeleton. But the resplendent grave goods are not the only reason the discovery rocked the world in the earliest 20th century. This tomb belonged to a woman. Queen Puabi, a name carried down through the millennia thanks to a lapis lazuli, seal pinned to her burial garment, lived at the height of Ur's power around 2600 BC. In her time, the ancient city-state held extensive sway across Sumer, a region nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates. Trade in Ur flourished, and trade routes extended from modern-day India to Sudan. As the main harbor for Indian goods, Ur garnered huge amounts of wealth. Though not contemporary documents mention Puabi, scholars believe she may have ruled in her own right, since the seal mentions no husband. And the article goes on to talk more extensively about the clothing in her tomb and the ornaments and everything like that and what those things mean. But so she was, so I guess this lapis lazuli, I think that's how it's like this little tiny thing that's on her clothing.
It's a seal.
Yeah, that says who she is. And I think it even contained a drawing of her sitting like at a banquet, like as a high official, basically. So that's interesting, given that she's a woman during this time frame and has ascended to this high position. And then another woman, very similar to her, and this would have been a little bit later, 2500 BCE. Her name was Kubaba. They called her Queen Kubaba. But what's interesting, she is the only woman ruler on the Sumerian king list. And I think the Sumerian king list is like over 130 kings or something like that. And it's in using cuneiform. And they have this surviving cuneiform tablet where it mentions her by name and that she reigned for 100 years. Though I think a lot of these reigns are not accurate because they like say things like 30,000 years and so anyway, but it spoke favorably of her. This would have put her, I think, in the 3rd or 4th dynasty of Kish, and it says that her son and her grandson were kings after her. And it also lists her as someone it says she was an innkeeper and a brewer prior to becoming the king queen. And a quote from the tablet: "The woman tavern keeper who made firm the foundations of Kish." And most likely she would have ascended to this position on her own accord, so by her own merits, because it doesn't say anything about her being with the king. So, yeah, so that's another woman. And what's interesting is that in episode 10, we talked about a woman of a similar stature from a very different area, the Iberian Peninsula, and that lady is called the Ivory Lady. And that's the skeletal remains that people for many years thought was a man because that person was clearly a leader, a powerful leader. And but this would have been a similar time frame. So the that ivory lady from the Iberian Peninsula was 2900 to 2650 BCE. So we're kind of sitting in the same time frame, but we're in different locations. So I thought that was interesting. The the area where the ivory lady came from, though, was not considered a city state. It was just more of a settlement. So it was like a pre-state settlement. Anyway, okay. Then another thing about I found interesting as well about Queen Kubaba. So she was obviously highly regarded. She made this list of kings, but there was this weird thing that came after her, an omen that was called the Omen of Kubao, which is another name for her. And it talked about basically an intersex either child or animal that was born, and how this omen said it was bad for the kingdom, and that basically that women ruling would bring waste to the land of kings, kind of a thing. So it was almost like some part of the culture had viewed the fact that she, as a woman, she shouldn't have been leading, kind of a thing, which was interesting in that you see this shift happen within the culture. Um, yeah. And they say I tried to find a date for that particular tablet. It had the only one I could find was 1100 BCE, so that would have been like over 1,000 years later. But I couldn't find another source to back that up, so I don't know. All right, and the last woman from this time frame, Enheduanna. She's known as the world's first author, and she would have. I got this information from an article from the BBC called "Eduana, the world's first named author," and it was published October 26th of 2022, but it didn't have an author, which was kind of weird. So
Hmm.
she would have lived around 2300 BCE, so this was a little bit later than the two other women we just talked about. And she was also her remains were also discovered by Sir Leonard Woolley as well. And her name in Sumerian means ornament of heaven, and she was high priestess of the moon deity Nana Suen. She composed 42 temple hymns and three standalone poems that, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, scholars considered an important part of Mesopotamia's literary legacy. And in conjunction with her high status as a religious figure and priestess, Eduana wielded political power as the daughter of Sargon the Great, a figure credited by some historians as the founder of the world's first empire. So that's a little bit of her. She obviously had more power. So, like, she was in that upper class, the top class of people, because she was royalty. So she would have enjoyed a higher level of freedom and privilege as well. Okay, so that's the end of the focus on the Sumerian city states. Yeah, and so what's happening in the world during this time frame as well? So we'll see the Egyptian society is doing their thing with their pharaohs, and then we see that there are cities developing in South America and in Peru, like in Central America. There's a particular civilization called the Olmecs that I might focus on at some point. So they're like 1500 to 900 BCE. And then you also have the Bronze Age happening in China. Hi, Coda. With the Jia dynasty from like 1900 to 1350 BCE. In the Indus Valley, you have civilizations there, like 2600 BCE to 1900. And then there are also the Minoans who are on the island of Crete. And some of these I'm gonna make episodes about these particular civilizations because there's hi bud because there's interesting things there to be found about how women were treated and what was happening with women in those cultures as well, because they're all a little different. The little patriarchies are a little different, and there's somewhere like especially the Minoans, it's more of like a shared kind of a lifestyle where there's more equality in general. And then the last thing I was going to share was basically after this Sumerian city state, you'll see empires rise up, like I think it's called the Akkadian Empire, the Babylonian Empire. You'll have the Hittites and the Syrians, and then kind of you'll have the Greeks happen, kind of emerge, but they kind of overlap there, I think, with the Assyrians. And that's that.
Cool.
You faded. You faded out. I looked up at one point and I was like, I think she fell asleep. Shh. Oh, Kara's even texting now. She's
I
like,
was not.
you just texted. I just heard it.
I did not.
Were you looking up something?
Yes.
What were you looking up?
How to stay awake.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. Look, I figured it out.
You did?
I did it.
You figured out how
I
to
stayed awake.
how to stay awake. You did it, Kara. You get a sticker.
it.
You get a smiley sticker.
I asked Amanda today if I had to be here for this one. And she said, I think it'd be weird if you weren't. And so here I am.
Here you are.
Sitting here
Looking pretty.
saying very little. Saying nothing at all.
There's another quote from Big Bang where Penny's doing that hemorrhoid commercial and she says, sitting pretty.
Sitting pretty.
You're just there, sitting pretty. Maybe with hemorrhoid cream. I don't know. No way of know.
I mean, no. Thank you.
You're okay.
Wow. Okay. You've lost it.
Yeah, I have. Okay. All right.
I know. I don't know. Okay.
That's good.
I know this is pertinent. It's just.
Thank you, Kara. Thank you for your vote of confidence in the subject matter. All right. We thank you for listening. I hope you too did not fall asleep, and we shall meet again.
No way of knowing.
There's no way of knowing. We shall meet again. Take care, and we'll see you next time.